Welcome to TezTalks Radio, the global Tezos ecosystem podcast hosted by Marissa True and Stu Elms. You're tuning into a special edition episode where we showcase some of the best conversations that took place at the Art Basel speaker series supported by Tezos. Enjoy. All right, good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who have not come across me already, my name is Marissa True. I'm the Senior Content Lead at Blockhouse, and I am also the host of TezTalks Radio, which is the global Tezos ecosystem podcast. So this next session, we are discussing the artist perspective of NFTs, and fortunately for me, I have an entire panel of said artists. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Nancy Baker Cahill, who's the founder of the Fourth Wall app. I have Dejha, the artist and co-founder of Operator, and I have Sasha Stiles, who is a crypto poet and author of, forgive the pronunciation, Technelegy? Technelegy, and also the co-founder of the VerseVerse. So firstly, thank you all for being here today. It's an absolute privilege to be able to interview each of you. I want to give our audience a bit of a backgrounder into who each of you are and the projects that you're each working on. So Nancy, I'd like to start with you. Can you tell us a bit more about what Fourth Wall app is and how it relates to your work?
Oh yeah, sure, thank you. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so excited for our conversation with these amazing artists I respect so much. So I have an AR art platform called Fourth Wall, and it's actually grown in scope. I founded it in 2018 as a means of kind of challenging how public art was both determined and consumed. So kind of trying to break down these really extreme sort of gatekeeping practices. And so it's both a platform that allows for collaboration, but also for site activations, site interventions. It has a very I would say it's kind of politically inflected. So I'm really interested in using AR to explore resistance and creative inclusion. So AR isn't the only technology I work with, but a lot of my work does involve AR, and I've been able to collaborate with now hundreds of artists and strangers to create conversation using this technology.
Wonderful. And Dejha, can you tell us a bit more about Operator?
Absolutely. So for the last 6 years, I've had a collaborative practice with Anya Catherine, and we bring together creative technology, immersive environments, as well as performance art. So my background is in HCI, human-computer interaction, and immersive environments, and Anya's in choreography and performance art. So together, bringing these to kind of merge into one world, depending on what the concept is for that artwork. So currently, we are very much focused on bringing the concept of privacy, which is based off of previous works like I'd Rather Be in a Dark Silence Than, which was a signal blocking trench coat, that any device that you put inside, whether it's RFID or a wireless device, couldn't be tracked, traced or monitored. So we translated this into an immersive installation, thinking through really the principles of Web 2 privacy, and now bringing that into the Privacy Collection, which is a durational NFT release, thinking about transparency and privacy inherent on the blockchain in a Web 3 context.
And Sasha, last but not least, can you share more about the VerseVerse?
Of course. Maybe I'll start by just giving a little bit more background on my practice too. So, and thank you so much for having us, and also super excited to be here with everyone. So I think I'm stretching the boundaries of the word artist just a little bit. I'm actually a poet mainly. I think of myself as a writer first and foremost. And I'm also an independent AI researcher. And I actually do a lot of work that integrates text with technology in different ways, and that's manifest as art projects, among other things. But I really do a lot of work with natural language processing, working with AI to kind of think about how we can push the limits of language using technology, how we can use speculative technologies and new digital technologies to really think about how we communicate with one another as human beings, and then also how we as humans communicate with and collaborate with machines. So that's kind of my area of personal interest in my creative practice. And then I'm co-founder of an NFT literary contemporary gallery called the VerseVerse, and along with two other writers who are also in the crypto space, Callan Iwamoto and Ana Maria Caballero, we co-founded this gallery at the end of last year to really create a space in the metaverse for poetry and for literature to live on the blockchain. And it's sort of an organic community that's really grown out of just a lot of writers kind of coming together, finding each other amidst the kind of the craziness of the crypto art scene. We've really been able to band together and really think through where and how to carve out a home for literature via NFTs, and how we can use NFTs to unlock new kinds of creativity for writers in particular, how to marry writerly creativity with artistry and creative code, and also how we can use the blockchain to empower writers financially in a way that hasn't really ever historically been possible. So that's kind of our mission.
So what I think is wonderfully diverse about this panel is for each of your respective art mediums, you're going about them in very, very different ways. So Nancy, you mentioned that you employ a lot of AR and VR technology, and a lot of your work explores themes such as social justice. So how do these mediums per se actually help deliver that impact a little bit better?
So how do they deliver that impact? How does the medium itself enable that kind of impact?
Yes, how do you reinforce your messaging through the mediums that you're choosing to work with?
So, well, I mean, first and foremost, I think it's a highly accessible medium. So I think that's sort of its first. That's what I would say is one of its primary values. To me, though, there's a kind of poetics to AR. There's a way in which it lives in that in-between space. It's both visible and invisible. You have to activate it. You have to be interested in having that idea activated. And then particularly when you experience AR in shared immersive space with others or alone, what I have found anyway, that it is if the artwork itself is rigorous enough and challenging enough and impactful enough, it will continue to live in your memory long after you've left that site. So I think it actually has tremendous staying power for an extremely ephemeral medium. I think its power is actually quite underestimated and underappreciated.
And Dejha, you mentioned HCI. How do you use those to basically reinforce the power of your work as well?
Sure. So the thing about HCI is it's really looking at innovative interfaces, or at least how I employ it in our collaborative practice. And, I'm very interested in how technology can fall to the background and become invisible and indistinguishable, from the environment you're within. And so this was really interesting when thinking of the pandemic and going from a practice that was highly physical and highly, digital in nature, but none of the technology was visible to the naked eye, to suddenly, everyone has screen-based, interfaces as the main medium for, interacting with art. So this was like a full shock, because it's kind of like we've been trying to, Anya and I, avoid screens at all costs, and now we're confronted, well, how are we going to embrace this screen? With that in mind, I do feel that it's important to really interrogate what a technology can be used for, how it's been used in the past, who it was made by, and why was it made. And I think all of these aspects are really important when employing technology, whether it's Web3 technologies, NFT technology, physical computing, facial recognition, computer vision, environmental sensors. Like, it really is something I think that cannot help but to enforce its own character on the work itself. So for me, the question isn't just about Web3 technologies and NFT technology, but any technology in general. There should be not only a conceptual use of it, at least for my practice, but also a critical understanding of the technology itself.
So through that, we're sort of exploring the dialogue between human interaction and computer interaction, how we connect the two in a way that where we know where the boundaries are, where the lines are, or what lines we want to draw ourselves. And then, Sasha, looking at poetry as a creative medium, a lot of the conversation as it relates to blockchain art is typically visual art. and actually, Dejha, this is a question I'm going to pose to you after, especially when it comes to immersive installations per se. How do you feel this space is, if at all, carved out a space for poets? Has it? Is there a space, or is that what you're building now?
Well, yes. I mean, we're building, but there is a kernel of it there already. I think when I first sort of arrived in the metaverse, it was sort of 2020-ish, and there was a lot going on with crypto art, of course. And I was actually commissioned to write a poem for a group exhibition of crypto artists, right, from around the world. And I think it was the only piece of text in the entire exhibition. And it was really interesting to kind of see that and think about where text could come in and kind of live alongside, coexist with these pieces of art. And it made me think a lot about the ability to take a poem off the page where we think it normally lives and find new ways to express it. And I think that's what a lot of writers on the blockchain are thinking about to some degree. We're thinking about how we can sort of push against this preconceived notion of what a poem is as something that's confined to a page, that's between the covers of a book, that's sitting in a dusty shelf in a bookstore. And how can we liberate language? How can we liberate poetry from that concept and let it be all the other things that it can be, and also that it has been throughout history? I think something that I think about a lot is that the history of poetry and what poetry has been in the past is also very different from what I think we assume poetry is now. Poetry started as an oral tradition, and it actually started as a very immersive kind of hybrid experiential art form where, people were using poems as performance pieces and performing them, in caves and to entertain people and to, to create these kinds of communal bonding experiences. And I actually sort of see the trajectory of poetry through the metaverse and through the blockchain as kind of enabling sort of a full circling back to that kind of an experience of poetry where it's not two-dimensional. It actually can live in all these different ways and forms, and it can kind of come to life and breathe. So I think the visual aspect of it is certainly something that I'm exploring a lot, that, again, I see a lot of other amazing poets and writers exploring too. There's also a long history of that with concrete poetry, visual poetry. That's existed long before the blockchain. But I also see a lot happening with spoken word poetry and sort of using electronically enhanced voiceovers and things like that to kind of take the tradition of slam poetry or spoken word poetry and really enhance it and augment it and create new kinds of experiences there, which is something I'm working on a lot myself. And then thinking about things like AR and VR poetry and how we can actually, put poetry out in the world and pin it to different places around the globe and visit it and, encounter it out in the world. So I think there's a lot of ways to kind of think about taking poetry and expanding it in addition to visuals.
So it's very much reimagining both the creation and the consumption of poetry, but also making it a more, I guess, and I hate to use this term because it's very corporate these days, but an inclusive environment for all kinds of artists and all kinds of mediums. But as you guys have ventured into this space very bravely, given it's such an early phase of this technological development, how has interacting with blockchain technology actually influenced your work? Nancy?
Well, just to your earlier point, I think I've always approached it and continue to approach it from a position of criticality. I don't remotely think that any of these tools are neutral, and I think they deserve that type of interrogation. I think it's crucial. And what first drew me to engaging with it was so much of what occupies my practice and my thoughts, what keeps me up at night, is sort of questions of accountability and systemic power. And so it was really interesting, the more I learned about blockchain and the more I learned about the contractual language of blockchain, there is all these promises, there's a huge promise of accountability, of trustless trust, and disintermediation. And as far as I can tell, currently, those just remain promises. They don't actually deliver. And so I wanted to build projects that both use the language of that technology to not just critique the technology itself, but also to kind of hold a mirror up to some of the broken social contracts that we have, and to kind of use it as a lens through which we could evaluate and metabolize some of the things that are happening in the world, whether it's the carceral state or climate crisis, that kind of thing. So a lot of my projects really have to do with thinking not just critically, but thoughtfully and intentionally, and building out the project such that accountability, not just sort of a broad social accountability, but the accountability between the collector and the artist. What is our culture? What is our collective accountability to artists as cultural producers? These are questions that are really important to me, and I think that this particular I think that blockchain itself, and you can't really separate it at this point from the commerce, but that there's a lot of opportunity to be critical and to think. I have to share this quote that I read earlier because it's been like rattling around in my brain. There's a wonderful Gene Youngblood quote, which is that he said, "Radicals don't predict, they build." And I feel as an artist that is my responsibility, and I share that responsibility with other artists to build what we want to see, because it's not going to be built just sort of by itself. There's no incentive in a capitalist society for progressive transformation. This is something we have to build. So that's my answer.
What I think what I love about your work is that, exactly as you said, you are engaging with the technology, but you're not shying away from asking the questions that really matter. At the end of the day, these answers haven't been written yet because the technology is not done being built yet. And therefore, if we don't ask these questions now, we risk essentially, and I've said this before, imprinting old systems onto new technology that just don't serve us anymore. And if we fall into that trap, we're back at square one, regardless of what medium we choose to engage in. Dejha, what about you? How has this influenced your work?
Well, first, I would say I'm very wary of tech demos and heroing the technology. And so while I love using technology as a core aspect of my practice and of my collaborative practice with Anya, I think there are certainly conventions, and conventions are there to be used, and they're useful. And then knowing when to use those conventions, now specifically, thinking within a crypto art context, and when to opt out of them, I think is also really important to the practice. Often using crypto mechanisms on the back end, and then on the front end, really ensuring that there's the sort of art speak that speaks to my and Anya's practice is really important, and not getting too, pushed into, hype mechanisms and financial mechanisms, because you have to imagine like the language built around even crypto art has been highly influenced by, hype beast culture, which is like, think about, why are we using the word drop? Why are we using the word drop? Where does that come from? Let's ask that question for a second. If it's coming from hype beast culture, do you want to drop art?
Yeah.
Dropping art, then the intention is to immediately flip it, right? And so I think just asking these questions and working as a community to kind of recover a new language is really, really important. But back to what value I think it immediately brings to an experiential and an immersive art practice is time and intimacy. So those are two really, really important aspects to immersion. And they're kind of a dream to have access to. So usually in a context where you're in a physical digital hybrid of a work of Anya and I's, you are probably in there for 30 minutes, 3 hours, many more hours after that. The ideal would be able to put someone, in a hotel context where they can sleep in the artwork, they can eat in the artwork, they can get sad and tired and cranky and then, worn out in the artwork. That's the ultimate form of immersion, right? But in this context, in a crypto art context, you have the duration of, okay, I can build with this audience participant, or as, if you sell artwork, I guess they call it the collector. We haven't sold artwork, and since I think the first time was in February or something like that. So, but imagine the audience participant taking their hand and through many micro nuanced experiences over not just a few hours, but a few months or a year, and being able to have that type of intimacy. And I think also the sort of cleanliness of the technology. When I say that, the fact that there's a piece of work that can be transferred to a new collector, and that there's this kind of seamlessness there of the interaction. I think there is a trustlessness and an automation that is helpful sometimes just from a interface standpoint, and then other times it's a complete nightmare. So it's like the picking and choosing of taking what works and leaving behind what doesn't.
And I think really teasing apart how exactly you want to engage with technology and knowing exactly where those boundaries lie on both a personal and professional level, I think isn't just for the sake of artwork, right? It's something that I think most of us struggle with every day. I mean, I've got my screen on right now, and I've also get those notifications about screen time reminders that tell me I've spent way too much time staring at Instagram reels. So I think understanding the intricacies of our relationship with the technology that, like you said, is a bit banal. It's faded into the background every day. Once brought to the fore and we're forced to pay conscious attention to, is something that I think people probably find quite challenging. And Sasha, looking at poetry, I know that Technelegy, you used an AI alter ego of sorts. So you created a fusion of your own words with this AI system to essentially create generative poetry. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So basically, as I mentioned before, I've been working quite a lot with natural language processing, which essentially is using computer programs to analyze and to process and to synthesize human speech. So essentially, it's training computers in how to understand how humans talk to each other, and then how to sort of replicate the way we speak and imitate us. And we can use that to generate large chunks of human-sounding text. So I find this really fascinating as a writer who's spent decades trying to hone the craft of writing, to be able to partner with a machine that has learned in a very short amount of time how to talk like a human, how to write like a human, is really fascinating to me. So I started working seriously with artificially intelligent language models in 2018, and back then the cutting edge was something called GPT-2, and I started sort of using it as an off-the-shelf kind of tool and just wanted to play with it a little bit. And as I got more and more pulled into it, I realized that I could start actually getting my hands into the language models and start, it's called fine-tuning the models, basically refining the system and training it on a curated set of information. So in my case, that was basically putting together a training data set of my poetry, my draft manuscripts, my research notes, all the things that I had kind of collated as the basis for the manuscript that I was working on, kind of dumped all that into this machine and was able to then use this language model that kind of knew the things that I knew a bit about how I write poetry, my style, my vocabulary, things like that, and was able to kind of refract my version of the way that I'd write a poem through the machine. And over time, I've kind of honed that model. I've honed the process. I've been kind of pushing it into different directions. And the book Technelegy is sort of one milestone that I've achieved, I think, so far, where there's sort of a duet between me and this AI persona, or this AI alter ego, which is my poet self powered by this AI, and me as a human poet, kind of talking to each other, both writing poetry in different ways, weaving poetry together. And really it's meant to be an exploration of what it means to be human in a nearly post-human world. Poets have our role sort of throughout history has been to consider what it means to be human, right, and to think about the fundamentals of the human condition, and to kind of take that very kind of big picture view. And so I'm thinking of using this AI poet to do the same sort of thing, to consider what does it mean to be a post-human being, what does it mean to be a transhuman being, what does it mean to be a machine swirling with all of this human data that we're uploading into it and that we're kind of forcing into these systems, and what might that mean for the future of ourselves as we're evolving concurrently with these machines.
So I think that's what's fascinating about speaking to the three of you, is that as diverse as each of your disciplines are, and the work that you produce is, all three of you sort of explore this dichotomy between, human and machine, and like our interaction with technology versus the natural world, and then trying to understand how these realms coexist, how they're bridged together. And so my question to all three of you, and whoever, thinks of your answer the fastest, please jump ahead first, is how has engaging with blockchain specifically and connecting to blockchain technology specifically impacted your work and your perspective on how these two realms coexist?
I mean, I can jump in, I guess, on that. So a couple different answers. I mean, one is, as you just said, I like all of us, do a lot of work that involves technology and nature. And I've done quite a lot of work that involves taking digital poetry, taking code, and removing it from the realm of the cybernetic and the virtual and putting it into the physical world. So for example, I have an ongoing poetry series called Analog Binary Code, which basically takes machine speak, binary code, which is zeros and ones, and I use it to translate poetry and language. And I've taken it out of the machine and I've actually used it in the real world, and I've sculpted binary code out of natural elements and other tactile bits and pieces. And for me, it's been really interesting to be able to kind of to use the blockchain as this liminal place to kind of take this work that really is thinking about the virtual and the physical, and to kind of keep going back and forth between these realms and kind of keep it going in this infinite loop, which is very much part of the ars poetica that I'm trying to write through these pieces, so that the format of these pieces kind of changes every time it goes from being a piece that's a sculpture in the physical world sitting on a piece of grass somewhere disintegrating into the ground, versus documentation of that then lives on the blockchain and is immutable. So on the one hand, you have this decaying piece of nature, and then you have this immutable technological rendering of it. And so to me, like as a somewhat conceptual poet, I find that so thrilling to be able to play with both of those things, and blockchain has really kind of unlocked that for me. And then just a really quick other, mentioning this other piece of it quickly, and this deserves more conversation, but I'll keep it short. Logistically and financially, blockchain has been really impactful for me and for a lot of writers and poets, and I think that's something that is important to talk about. It's no secret that that writing and poetry in particular is not a lucrative profession. I think we can all agree that poetry is incredibly culturally valuable and really important to us, but it's been really hard for poets to survive, let alone thrive, for a really, really long time. And what I think is so interesting about blockchain in that, from that perspective, is that it really gives poets the ability to self-publish things and to kind of put their work on par with the work that artists are doing, and kind of put that kind of a value on it, and really imbue NFT poems with currency in every sense of that word, and really make it feel relevant and valuable in a market sense. So I think that's also been a really really important piece of the puzzle for a lot of writers so far, that this is a way to potentially hopefully make a living, or at least make it a little bit easier to make a living.
So in that sense, it's also in a way offering, I guess, financial validation of the value of your work, which, as you said, not the most lucrative industry is the arts, and that's more it's not because people don't enjoy art, it's more because I guess the systems don't currently serve the artists in the way that they should, which is why a lot of this attention has rested on NFTs and Web3s, because it can be used as a tool for empowerment, as you suggest. Dejha, something I wanted to allude to, you mentioned earlier that we don't necessarily have the language that we need to be able to communicate about the work that you're building in this space in a way that doesn't overly commercialize it or commodify it, because I think collectively many of us struggle with being able to articulate the relationship between blockchain and art in a holistic way that doesn't have to do with the ubiquitous drop or new monetization models, or putting it in a very commercial light. So what are the gaps in language that we actually need to remedy, and what sort of solutions do you see that maybe have emerged through your work?
Well, I think the first thing is recognizing the language that doesn't resonate with the practice and the values of the practice. So I think that's number one, knowing what language you don't want to adopt. For example, this aspect of utility I find very interesting. Anya and I recently created a piece called Let Me Check with the Wife. We're also married and fully immersive to have a collaborative art practice and be married. Yeah.
Mixing business with family.
And then we had this piece, as soon as the collector buys this piece, they also have, pop up in their wallet. We created a second smart contract, and it ties itself to the primary contract, which was on Super Rare. And this other one is called Marital Obligations, and it just kind of follows the main NFT around, no matter what, and they can never be separated. And so in this, finding that, we have this kind of issue with this expectation of utility, from the artist, within the NFT space, kind of like commenting on that with this concept of like reverse utility. So the marital obligations, the collector has to provide us utility every year on our anniversary, provide us something. And so like even just kind of messing with the mechanisms and aspects like this, I think can help, like also as the artist work through what are the issues, and then also maybe inspire others to kind of look at the language that just feels so common and natural in the space. So I think that's the first one, just like investigating and interrogating, the language that exists and making sure that it speaks to you and using it as a convention if it feels right, and then creating, new language if that doesn't, suffice.
Can I just add to that? Because I think that's really important, and I think that's part of building. And when I first started doing these site interventions, a lawyer said to me, this space that you are playing in is going to be policed, it's going to be monetized, so you need to get ahead of it discursively. You need to lay the discursive foundation, and instead of saying site activation, talk about idea activation, because that exists in a shared cultural thought space that actually is untouchable. And that's really compelling, and I think that to your point, like we have to push into that, and we have to redefine it and continue to redefine it and, ping pong off of each other and find new solutions. But I also just wanted to answer your question that you asked earlier about what is compelling here. And for me, as someone who's sort of obsessed with civics and obsessed with the state of the dissolution of democracy, for example, just a small thing in the United States, a lot of these conversations have to do, I'm so bored, honestly, by a lot of the conversations about NFTs. I'm just bored to tears. But what's really interesting and compelling to me is our questions of governance. And I remember early on meeting with a blockchain developer who talked about liquid democracy, and this was over a year ago, and I remember my brain just lit up, and I thought, wait a second, these new models, how could we build new models? How could these new models function? How could they be held accountable? How could they serve us? How could they serve us well beyond, these sort of hype markets and these techno-utopian this propaganda machine, and how could we actually use them and apply them, whether it is to actual governance, which doesn't seem likely anytime soon, but even within DAOs, which I don't think are perfect, and I think that they're too, at the moment, discrete and unconnected. But this is why I'm so interested in mycelium and in different types of networks of interdependence and interconnectedness and interoperability, honestly. And how could we look to both, how could we use biomimicry and the structures of these technologies as they evolve to build out different systems, because the ones we have obviously are broken. There's no other way to put it. They're broken, they're not serving us, they serve a very small number of people, and we will not survive any of the challenges, the existential and epistemological challenges that we all collectively face right now without it.
So again, this discursive debate, I think, is absolutely critical to the future of how this technology prevails in the art world, because some might just call it basic semantics, but discourse is important. Discourse actually helps shape the attitudes in our approach. And like we were saying earlier, if you're using terminology like drops, then you are potentially over-commercializing something that is to be consumed on a level that doesn't necessarily have, a financial value attached to it. It should be for the beauty of it in and of its own sake and the point that it's trying to make. But then when we look at this space more broadly, do you what can we actually do as individual players dabbling in these ecosystems to actually build this world in a way that is a healthy environment, that we don't have to worry about all of these challenges as then when they crop up during the development of this technology? Is it up to us?
Can I answer? I'm sorry, I don't mean to
Yes.
monopolize. I just want to say, one place to start, in my opinion, is with artists' rights, is to start sort of from here and from that position of intimacy and knowledge, and advocate not just for ourselves, but for each other, and to use the contractual language, to use these agreements to build out much more robust and healthy ecosystems for remuneration, for protection, for provenance, for all of those things. To me, that's one place to start. That's sort of what I'm obsessed with currently.
And one thing we actually touched upon in a previous discussion was this notion that you touched upon, Dejha, which was utility, and not trying to craft, too much utility and trying to turn it into something that it doesn't actually have to be. When, Nancy, as you mentioned, we could rely on the fact that an NFT is a form of provenance. It's the ability to track when it was created, who owned it, and why it existed, and take it from there rather than trying to develop this comprehensive, brand and marketing experience for the artists and their communities. But then going back to this notion of, social realities in these digital spaces, as, three women in this space, do you find that it's inclusive enough? Do you find that you're coming up against challenges? I'm seeing a few eyes go wide, so I feel like I've touched on a nerve here. Firstly, if you had to rate it out of 10 in terms of its inclusivity and what you think needs to actually change to make this a more inclusive environment. And like I said, I wish there was a better word for that, but you know what I mean.
Well, the fact that it's the four of us here in conversation together is a good start. I think, this kind of curation and programming is definitely a step in the right direction. All of us doing what we're doing and supporting each other and saying each other's names in the right rooms and things like that, I feel like that's extremely important. It is definitely, in my experience, I'll just speak for myself, it has been challenging. And, over the past year, I've gone to, well, let me say this. I'm in a very comfortable bubble within the VerseVerse and kind of within my writing community. And I think that is very different from the crypto space at large. So I have very consciously chosen to cultivate a community there that I feel is very much aligned with my personal values. And I feel very grateful and lucky about that. When I've had the opportunity or when I've been asked to kind of venture beyond that and kind of pop into other communities and bubbles within the crypto world, I've quickly realized how different that is. So I think for me, what I'm thinking a lot about, and back to this discussion of building, is how to take some of what I hope and what I think we're trying to do with the VerseVerse and with the poetry community, and maybe let that start percolating out a little bit. So, at the VerseVerse, we're very selective, we're very curated, we're probably very slow compared to a lot of what's happening in the crypto space. We're very inclusive, we're very dynamic, we're very much about kind of personal relationships and people kind of bringing in people that they think need to be there, deserve to be there, reaching out and amplifying voices and things like that. And it's very time consuming, it's very work intensive to do it in the way that we're doing. It's not automated, it's not like we're trying to do some collectibles project, it's a lot of human to human interaction. And I think this space still needs a lot of that. So, I hope, small projects like what we're doing can maybe be models for maybe larger things that can come down the road, or they can be things that other projects or other organizations or communities might look at and say, well, NFTs don't have to be like this. Crypto doesn't have to be this. It doesn't have to be this pace, or, it doesn't have to look like this or sound like this, and we don't have to talk like this. It can also be all these other things. And I think that's, at least in our little corner of the world, what we're trying to fight for.
Yeah, absolutely. Dejha?
So I think people forget women's role in technology.
The first computers.
Agreed.
I think people forget about this. So as an artist who has been working with technology for over 15 years, I've rocked up to an installation that was my own. And, maybe my assistant was a male, and someone in the space comes over and asks him the question instead of me. Okay. And he's like, hey, yeah, she's in charge of this, you know? And this idea that women cannot be trusted with technology. And when you think of the amount of resource it takes, like expense, space, you know, experimentation, then I think often women are not trusted with that level of technology. Mm-hmm. And I'm speaking from experience, having been, you know, in scenarios like this, and I think that's changing, you know, but I think there's still an undertone that is still there. I wouldn't say that's completely, you know, out of the system. Do you want to jump in? I just see you shaking your head.
So just to build on that, there's so much internalized misogyny. Sorry to just like wave the saber here, but I must say I was at a tech. I won't name any names, but I was at a presentation of a certain artifact that was wonderful and beautiful, and the person who created the artifact was looking for feedback from the audience, and one of the people men in the audience raised his hand, and he said, "You know what? I love this. It's so great. It really passes the mom test." And one of the women in the audience who was a developer for this blockchain she didn't even raise her hand. She just said, "Excuse me, could we actually say it passes the parent test? Do we have to isolate mothers?" And I thought, that's the key. That's what it is. It's this sort of lowered expectation. Do you get this? Is this like, you know, I'm going to talk to the guy next to you who might know more. You know, it's that kind of ambient impact
is good. Yeah.
of heteropatriarchy that we all live in and participate in unwittingly at times. But I think to your point, Sasha, and to your point, you keep making the work, you insist on showing up, you boost other women and non-binary creators, and just continue to fight the fight with eyes wide open and with a clear understanding of exactly what's going on. That's why, like, I'm gonna rate it as a 4. I think there's a lot of room for improvement.
Can I just
yes, please.
Yes to everything that was just said, and in crypto, but also, I mean, I've experienced this in lots of other ways, and you're just making me think about the fact that when I started writing poetry that involved technology, when I started writing poetry about neural nets and, you know, life extension and things like that, I would go into poetry workshops and I would take these pieces in, and it was often a lot of men who would kind of look at me and say, wow, this is really cerebral. You know, it's not very poetic, it's more like sci-fi, and, you know, maybe poetry is more about human experience. Should you be writing more about things that are going to be like really resonant with women and have more of a, you know, a feminine sensibility to it? And I think, again, just doing the work, like ignoring that and just persisting and just continuing to do what I wanted to do, you know, being a woman in AI, being a woman in crypto, being a woman founder in Web3, and just doing it, and, you know, finding the people who are willing to do it with you and who are willing to lift you up is just, you gotta just keep going.
So once again, we're circling back to this idea of how much of this is internalized in discourse and how critical the language you use and the conversations that we have, just like the ones we're having today, are going to be towards actually shaping this hopefully much better and inclusive and not unbiased. I think it's very difficult to create environments that are wholly unbiased, but those that are aware of its own prejudices and can systematically act against them. And I think, and like we said before, I think, or at least I hope, and I'm actually fairly optimistic that as we build out this new technology, because it's still emerging and because we have a say, that maybe, just maybe, we can avoid replicating all of those old systems that just simply do not work for us and are rate-limiting steps to basically being able to shine a spotlight on the amazing work that, you know, women are creating in this space, or, you know, anyone of any gender for that matter. We only have 2 minutes left on the clock, and very frankly, this has been an absolute delight, so I'm actually quite upset that it's almost over. But I wanted to ask each of you a final question, which is simply, given what you now understand about the space, if you were to cast yourself back to the very beginning when you first, you know, heard about blockchain technology, what is the one technical skill you wish you could have had built then that you would take in through your work now? Forgive me, it's a fairly abstract question.
I honestly wish I had a better understanding of coding. It's not, like, neuroanatomically, it doesn't seem to work for me. Better on collaboration. But I think that I'm genuinely interested in how algorithms are crafted, constructed, and deployed. And so I think that's enormous power. I think if I weren't an artist, I'd really want to be a hacker. I think hacking is the ultimate, I shouldn't say that, it's probably being recorded. Never mind, but there's no risk because I can't do it. But that's what I would wish for.
Dejha? Sasha? Either one of you, whichever one's ready first.
I'm just not in a rush, because I'm just more interested in studying how technology works and taking the time. So I don't have any regrets or wishes really about that.
Good answer.
I think I actually agree with that quite a lot. I mean, there's definitely there's a part of me that wants to know how to make smart contracts myself and things like that. But another part of me sees a lot of folks just kind of going in a million different directions, trying to learn how to do brand new things from scratch, really complicated things from scratch, and then trying to do everything. And I think what I've learned being in this ecosystem, being on the blockchain, is that a lot of it really revolves around collaboration and really finding the right partnerships and then kind of delegating and figuring out how to be a symbiotic organism together. So I think for me as a writer, I'm coming from this mindset of, solitary writer alone in her room, to now kind of being part of this global network, this global community. I think I love it. I'm really, it's my favorite thing about being on the blockchain. So I think to me, rather than thinking about a specific skill or technology or anything, I would think about just how to cultivate community, how to recognize what your strengths are, how to sort of acknowledge where your weaknesses are. And certainly if there's things you wish you want to know about, then by all means chase your obsessions, and that's where good things will happen. But I wouldn't, necessarily say that if you feel something's lacking, you don't have to learn it yourself. You can just learn how to be part of this community and find the right partners and join forces and make great things happen.
Well, on that note, Nancy, Dejha, Sasha, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives. It's been absolutely enlightening and a total joy for myself as a moderator. And thank you to the audience, of course, for tuning in.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.